Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look at the basics of creating your first form or dialog. Today we're going to be doing a video on creating your first form or dialog in the PowerBasic Windows compiler. What we have on screen at the moment is a completely blank sheet. This is what you get when you launch the Windows development environment initially. You may well have a good idea what you want your first form or dialog to look like because you're basing it on an existing paper form or an existing application. Alternatively, you may be starting from a clean sheet. So what we're going to do first of all is we're going to create a file which will contain our basic code. If you move up to the toolbar at the top of the screen and click on the down arrow, you'll get a number of options. Now today we're just after a generic PB program. When you click on that, the application will write a few lines of code for you, because we're going to be compiling into an exe file, and it will create the main entry function which is called pbmain. So first thing to do is we will save that to disk, and we will call our file firstform.bas. And having saved that file, the next thing we want to do is to start designing a dialog. If you go up to the Tools menu, you'll see there's an entry for PowerBasic Forms. Now when you purchase the PowerBasic Windows compiler, you have the option of purchasing the add-on, which is indeed the Forms Designer. Once you click on this, it will bring another window up. Now the message dialog it's showing here is telling you that the file we're working on was not actually created by PowerBasic Forms, which is quite correct. We'll just say we want to import this, and it will give us a blank sheet. Now if we want to create a form, we'll come up to the top here, and on the toolbar there is a new dialog button. So if we click on that, it gives us a new dialog and a little toolbox. Now we want our dialog on screen or form to be a little bit bigger than this, so we will stretch our form up to a reasonable size. Now this is a form which is going to appear first on your application. The form has a title, which at the moment defaults to dialog 1. If we double click somewhere on the body of the form, it will bring up a properties box. And this is where we can change the caption of our dialog. So we'll just change that and we'll call it first form. Internally in the code, this form is referred to by this ID name. Now we can leave it as dialog 1, but dialog 1 is not terribly helpful because it doesn't tell you what the dialog actually does, and you will get to the point of having applications with many dialogues. So you can either click on the little button at the side here and use the caption name and the ID name, or you can type it in yourself, and it automatically assigns the next available ID number to our dialog. Now at the moment I'm just going to leave the foreground and background colors as the system colors, the defaults, and I'll leave the font as standard MS Sans Serif 8-point. So if we hit OK on that, we'll see that our dialog now has first form. Now there's a few things you'll want to do on your dialog before we start putting controls on it. We double click on it again and go to the Styles tab. On the Styles tab, this will tell you information about the dialog itself. Now at the moment there are a number of things actually already pre-selected for you. One of the ones we want to select is this one, DS Center. This will center your dialog when it loads on the center of the screen. There may be times when you wish to design your dialogue so that they don't appear in the center of the screen, but most of the time you'll want them in the center. The other things that are useful to have is we'll tick the WS caption and the sys menu. Now if these two are ticked, it will allow us to have the X at the top right hand corner of the dialog so we can close the dialog down, and if we tick minimize box as well, it will give us a minimize box like up here so we can minimize the dialog down to the taskbar. So if we hit OK on this, we'll see we now have the X and the minus showing. Now at any point you can always test your dialog by clicking on the toolbar where there's a little switch which is labelled Test Dialog. And this will show your dialog on screen with the title, the X and the minus. And we can exit the test mode. So what can we put onto this dialog? Well, if we look at the toolbox at the side, we'll see all the different types of controls we can actually put onto a dialog. First thing we'll want to do, if we double click on the OK button, we get a button appearing on the screen. Now, like many dialog designers, if you double click on the object, you'll get a button properties up, and you can decide what it is you want that button to do and what the button's actually called. Obviously calling it button 1 isn't very helpful, so I'm going to change this one to call it exit, and this will be our exit button. Again, it will designate a default name for the button, and as this is going to appear in code, it's helpful for the name of the button to reflect its function. So on this there are a number of defaults built in, and I will pick the ID abort one in this case since we're effectively exiting from the form, and we'll just OK that. Now we'll put another button on the screen, and this can be a button that allows us to do something. And again, the buttons don't have to be this size, you can indeed make them larger. So call this our Do It button. And if we look at the styles, we'll see that the text is currently centered on the button. If we left justify it, the text will move to the left side of the button or the right side of the button, but we'll leave it in the center of the button for the moment. Now we've got a couple of buttons on the screen. What else can we put on? We can put a text box on the screen to allow the user to put some information in. Again, if we double click on the text box, we can then set its name, what appears in the text box. So we'll blank out the data so there is no caption to appear in the box. And we'll call it text name. It's always quite useful naming your objects on a form in a standard way. That way when you come across them in code, you'll know that if something says text name, it's a text box. And if it's label, for example LBL name, would be a label for the name. And if we OK that, we'll see that it's blanked out the data. Now there's nothing that will tell the user on this form what this box is actually for. So we'll add a label above the text box to ask the user to put their name in. And to be helpful in the code, I'm calling this label name. Another thing to highlight to the users that this is something they need to do is to change the colors. Now we can quite happily change the color to blue, for example, and the text would appear in blue. If you think the text is too small, you can always change the font size and push it up, for example, to 12 to make it bigger. Or if you think it doesn't look bold enough, we can select bold. And having selected the object on screen, you can move it around the screen using the arrow keys, up or down, left or right, for fine adjustment. You can also change the location on screen by the third tab, which is position and size. Whenever a dialog is created, there is an option to create it using dialog units or pixels. As the people who are going to be using your application may well have different resolutions on their screens, the dialog units are a method of generically creating objects on a screen which are resolution independent. So our dialog coordinates are dialog units. So we can actually move it left and right, up and down by amending these in here. So having got that information on the screen, this is about as minimalistic a form as you can possibly get. So what we're going to do next is we're going to save this form and have a look at the code that our form designer has actually generated. So we'll click on the save at the top of the screen. It will ask us where we want to save the file to. Now we're just going to overwrite the first form we created earlier. And when we close this down, it will tell us that the first form.bas has been changed. And do we wish to reload it? And the answer of course is yes. Now it's created a whole pile of code in here, and there are a few things to watch out for. PBForms creates code within these tags. For example, PBForms begin includes, PBForm end includes. Anything between these two tags is entirely under the control of the form designer. If, for example, I went in and put some of my code in here, then it would exist up until the time we next went into the form designer. And when the form designer saved again, this code would disappear. So if you are going to add in any additional code, if you add it outside of these blocks that the form designer is actually maintaining. So if we wanted to create any additional constants, then we would do them down here outside of the begin and end block. Now we added a number of objects on the screen and we did some renaming. We started off with a couple of labels and we ended up with the text box and a label. The form designer has highlighted these to say that these don't actually exist anymore and it's safe to remove them. So we'll just take these out, and we have our dialog itself with a unique number. We have the exit button with a constant. We have a do it button and a text box and a label name. Now further down the code you'll see that the form designer has done a couple of declares in here. Now these strictly speaking aren't necessary anymore, but the form designer puts them in for you anyway. And the pb-main, which was the single function that existed in the file before we entered the forms designer, now has a few lines of code in it. It has one to initialize the common controls, and one to call this function, which is to show the first form. And its single parameter is the parent of the form, which in this case is the desktop. Now, if we look at the functions inside our application by pressing the F2 button, we will see that there are two PB-mains. The second PB-main is a copy of our original code before we called the forms designer. Now we can just delete that quite happily because we don't need that. So that's us back down to one PB-main. We'll see there are two other functions in here, one being a standard function and one being a callback function. We'll come back to the callback function in a moment, but if we double click on the first one, this shows us the function that's called from PB-main, which will display our form on the screen. Now, as I said before, there are a couple of beginning and end tags in here, so that anything between here and here is controlled by the forms designer. So what the forms designer has actually done is it's typed in all this code for you. The details of creating the dialog, where the dialog appears on screen, how wide and how high the dialog is, and the other parameters on this function are describing what the form is actually going to be doing and how it's going to be handled. We have two control add buttons, one for our exit button and one for the do it button. And again, we have the location on screen and the width and height. Now, while you can amend the code in here to make, for example, a button bigger or smaller, it's just as easy to go into the forms designer and do it in there. And once we get to the PBForms end dialog, there's a single line of code which is to show the dialog on the screen in a modal fashion. In other words, when it's shown modally, the dialog will stay on screen and wait for the user to actually do something. And while we're waiting, it will be running this function. And this is the callback function we saw when we hit the F2 button. The callback function is your event handler for the form. It handles everything on the form itself, when buttons are pressed, when text is keyed into text boxes, when text boxes get focus. Everything is handled within the callback function. So let's have a look at the callback function itself. So in the callback function, it's broken up into a number of individual events. There is an event which occurs when the dialog is initialized. This is before it actually appears on the screen to the user, so you can take this opportunity to populate things on the dialog so the user gets to see them. There is an event for when the dialog is activated. The Forms Designer has put this in for you to handle the saving of control focus and the restoring of control focus. This will be where you click away from your application and you click back again. Further down, we have a WM command event. And this is where the individual events on objects on the form are actually handled. At the moment, it's handling an event for the exit button, which is our ID abort. It will display a message box, and on our do it button, it will also display a message box. There is also nothing on the handling of the text box at the moment. So if we tried running our application just to see what it would do, we'll see it has indeed displayed a form on the screen with our label, our text box, our exit button, and our do it button. If we click on either of these buttons, we'll see at the moment all it does is it throws up a message box. And to exit the application at the moment, we have to click the close gadget at the top right hand corner of the form. If we want to change our exit button to actually exit from the application, we need to exit the form itself, and as it's the only form running, then the application will complete. So to close off a dialog, all we need to do is to put in a dialog end command. And dialog end takes a single parameter. In this case, we're going to be using one of the constants. You'll see these constants appear all the way through our code. For example, this one up here is testing the value of the callback function's active control. In other words, which control have we actually done something on? And if the active control happens to be our abort button, then we will check that we've clicked on it and we will execute any line of code we've got between the if and the end if. We're doing a dialog end for this particular form. This dialog will now complete. So if we run that code now and we click on our exit button, it will exit the application, which is ideal. So we will take the message box out of the do it button to allow us to actually pick up what the user has actually typed in the text field. So how do we do that? Well, first thing to do is to create a variable to pick up the value that user has actually typed into the name field. So up at the top of the function, we'll put a local command in to create a local variable. And we will create a variable called strname, and it's going to be a string. So down here, we want to actually pick up the value that the user has actually typed in to the text name box. So we're going to use a control get text command. That takes this parameter first, which is the handle of the form we're actually in. So that's basically a constant in here. We need to paste in the handle of the text box, and we're sending that value to strname. Now, just to prove that we have indeed picked up that value, we're going to use a message box command to display that on screen. So we try running this now, and we type a name into the text box, and we hit the do it button, it will indeed pick up the value we've entered into the text box and display it on the screen. So while this is a very basic form, you can see how you can design a form with a number of fields to take information from the user. And for each of those, you would use a Control-Get command using the text option to pick up from the field on screen and put it into a variable. And having picked up all your variables on screen, you can then decide what you want to do with them. Most likely in many applications, if you're gathering information from a user, you would then use that information to save into a database, save to a file, or send off to a server. So now that we've created this very basic application, let's have a look at the files that have actually been created in our code folder. So we have our first form.bas, which is the file we've been working with. Each time we change, PowerBasic keeps a backup for you, which you can always go back to if you need to. It's also created the executable, so if I double click on the executable, it would run the application. It's created a log file. This is just PowerBasic's log of the compilation. There are a number of other files, a PBR file, an RC file, and a res file. These files are created and maintained by the forms designer. There's an XP theme XML file, which is used to describe the manifest for displaying the form style on screen. These last four files, normally you will not have to bother with, because the forms designer will take care of them for you. Since PowerBasic Windows compiler will compile down to a single executable, the only file that you have to give access to the user is the executable itself. All the other files are entirely for your development use. When you're releasing this to a production environment, the executable file itself, the application, is the only thing that you need to release. This has been a short introduction to creating your first form. We will move on in the next video to some more advanced features of creating forms. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.